The Bleach manga has had its fair share of controversial story moments over the course of its 700 plus chapter run, and today I want to take something of a trip down memory lane as we explore 10 of the most explosive of those moments among the community. So, what do I mean when I say that? Well, as many of you know, and as many of you veteran Bleach fans out there will have likely shared in a similar experience as well, I spent a lot of time frequenting the Bleach forums back in the day, from one manga to Bleach Exile, and later Bleach Asylum, whether that was reading spoilers or discussing chapters, and remember many of the craziest upsets from the weekly chapter releases. So then, these aren't necessarily the moments that upset or annoyed me personally the most, though I'm sure I will share in some of the sentiment every now and then, but the most controversial moments that I remember specifically the community collectively being in uproar over. Of course, if you think I missed any moments that you remember causing a stir among Bleach readers, make sure to let me know down in the comments. And of course, before we get started on the video, consider hitting subscribe down below if you enjoyed the video today, as it does help out massively as we try and reach our goal of 300,000 subs by the end of the year. I do appreciate it so very much. Also, check out my Patreon as well if you want to support the channel that extra step further, just like all of the patrons on screen are doing. Again, that does make a massive difference, and again, I really do appreciate it. And finally, before we get started, there will be some spoilers for what is left of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime in the video to follow. Now, I'm gonna kick things off with an honourable mention, and it's an honourable mention because it is very small scale, and crucially, this one is personal. I'm not sure how controversial this moment really was on a wider scale, but for me, I was very disappointed back in the day, and that's the arrival of Don Kanoji in the Deicide arc. It feels so quaint to talk about this now, and it's honestly eye-opening how insignificant this moment really feels in the grand scheme of the Bleach story, but you better believe I was kinda mad. In chapter 410, as the Deicide arc races to a terrifying conclusion, and a now nearly transcendent Aizen has arrived in the real Karakura town with seemingly no one left to stop him. He discovers Tatsuki and Keigo, and moves in to finish them off. The situation seems helpless, and don't forget, this is the culmination of the entire Rankar arc, which had been stretching on for almost 250 chapters at this point. As Ichigo was stuck in the Dangai, training for the final Getsuga Tensho, it felt like something had to give. And yes, at the end of the chapter, a now infamous silhouette appeared, just as Tatsuki had given up all hope. That single shot of a foot crashing onto the scene had the community speculating for the next 7 or so days like crazy. Could it finally be the return of Ryuken, acting as the last line of defense for Karakura Town? Maybe Tessai was actually going to show up and do something, as it hadn't been that long since we learned he was actually the Kido Corps commander in Turn Back the Pendulum. Or the real Hail Mary. Were we finally about to be introduced to the mythical Zero Division, again as were mentioned in Turn Back the Pendulum? That last one is so far-fetched now that it makes me laugh, but we had so little context for the elusive Royal Guard at the time that yes, people figured now made sense for them to arrive. Again, I was reading weekly spoilers back here. I didn't stop doing that until chapter 450, and when word began to spread, the mysterious figure not only wasn't any of those, but was in fact Don Kanoji of all characters. I didn't think it was real until the images came in. These days I can look back on it and laugh, but yeah, I was kinda mad. Alright, but moving on to the list itself, and in 10th place, we have Hitsugaya's Ice Clone. One of the most ridiculous and, in my opinion, unbelievable cliffhangers of the series even to this day. At the end of chapter 355, Harabel releases her Zanpakuto, and prepares to strike Hitsugaya with her new form. Although the little captain readies himself, the Espada suddenly slashes him in two, moving way too quickly for Hitsugaya to react, splitting the captain's body almost straight down the middle. as his arm and leg drop to the ground below, smashing into the earth. Blood erupts from Hitsugaya's wound as he looks on, shocked, even questioning what's just happened. And the start of chapter 356 even doubles down on this, blood pumping from Hitsugaya as the rest of his body hits the floor. Not only was this a truly shocking end to the chapter, but as virtually the first thing we actually saw of real note from the top three Espada, well, it seemed to signal that they would be as strong and as dangerous as we had all hoped and expected them to be. Except it's revealed a few pages later that Hitsugaya is actually, miraculously, completely fine. Hitsugaya states that he's glad he was cautious, and it's revealed that what Harabel actually struck was... well, I've never been entirely sure. Hitsugaya somehow created a perfect ice version of not just himself, but as you can see on this panel, seemingly the sky around him as well, which then shatters and falls apart like glass, which is apparently what the Espada hit. So, despite her sword cleaving straight through it, Harabel had no idea that she was striking something made of ice, and frankly, I can't blame her. Somehow Hitsugaya is able to make his ice clone magically bleed profusely, as well as act independently. It looks down, it questions what's going on, while the rest of his body, which again is only ice, apparently falls to the ground in a very realistic fashion, and looks completely real. To this day, I still do think this is nonsense. This is basically a Kyoka Suigetsu level illusion. And honestly can't help but wonder if Kubo wanted to have Harabel actually injure Hitsugaya on this cliffhanger, but realised after the fact that maybe he'd gone a little too far with the injury in question and dialed it back in a way that unfortunately just turned out to not be believable. That's complete speculation on my part. But worst of all, this moment, rather than being an awesome display of Harabel's power and speed, instead completely set the tone for her battle moving forward, and really for the top three Espada in general. Alright, but next up we have our first character death of the list, and it's one that surprised a lot of people back in the day, just not in a good way. And that's the death of Yachiru Unohana in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Now, if you were reading Bleach weekly for a long time, then you will remember waiting with bated breath for Unohana to finally do something of note. It had been clear for a while that there was more to this kind, motherly figure than she let on. Even the brutish soldiers of the 11th Division were absolutely terrified of her, and we had no idea why. Not only that, but as one of the oldest captains of the Gotei 13, one who seemed to even command Yamamoto's respect, Unohana was believed to be enormously powerful. However, in her position as captain of the 4th Division, it seemed she was relegated to the role of medic and nothing more. However, Kubo, clearly aware of the community's growing desire to see Unohana in action and to learn more about her character, promised in the lead-up to the Thousand Year Blood War arc that not only would she finally fight, but she'd even unravel her braid too, indicating that we would come to understand the character in full. However, while everything Kubo said was technically true, it all transpired in a way people didn't expect. Unohana did fight, yes, but she only fought Kenpachi, and only for the purposes of training him and helping him become stronger. She never gets the chance to unleash her own power against an actual enemy. Unohana did indeed unravel her braid and reveal her true nature, that of the first Kenpachi and the first captain of the 11th Division, both of which were amazing twists and helped make the character infinitely more interesting, only for her to be immediately killed off at the end of the battle, just as the character was really coming into her own. Sure, there's an in-universe reason for her having to die here, but there's no denying people were very sad to see Unohana killed off so unceremoniously just as she was at last beginning to be developed as a character beyond just the healer captain. And all of it was in service of helping Kenpachi grow even stronger, which is fine on paper, and him at last becoming able to hear his Zanpakuto is definitely a compelling character arc trade-off. But he's already overexposed as a character as it is, doesn't win another fight for the rest of the arc despite this revelation, and you can't help but think the whole situation could have been handled in a different, more satisfying way for Unohana's long gestating character. Here's hoping that if the Hell arc ever does actually happen, Unohana will return as we all kind of expect, and play some kind of cool role there as well. Next, we have our first moment from the story that has yet to be animated. Yhwach's ultimate defeat via the Still Silver Arrow. With the Bleach manga rapidly, and I do mean rapidly, coming to a close in 2016, it was impossible to imagine how the heroes were going to overcome Yhwach, who, thanks to both the Almighty and the Soul King's power, was now easily the most broken character in the series at this point. And when it became brutally apparent that there were only 5 chapters remaining, well, that question intensified even further. Enter the Still Silver Arrow, a last-minute deus ex machina devised by Ryuken Ishida to bring down the Quincy King once and for all. In chapter 682, a measly 2 chapters from Yhwach's defeat, and only 4 from the end of the series in general, Ryuken reveals the Still Silver Arrowhead, a weapon forged from the silver blood clots created by Ausvalen in the hearts of dead Quincy's. With this special arrowhead in his possession, Uryu fires it into Yhwach during the final battle, somehow bypassing the Almighty, thus essentially performing an Ausvalen on the king himself, stripping him of all of his powers and giving Ichigo enough time to cut the villain in 2, ending the war. Yes, it effectively comes out of nowhere to solve the Yhwach problem, wherein the villain had become so enormously powerful that it seemed defeating him was completely impossible, the very definition of a deus ex machina, but there are a few reasons as to why I only have the Still Silver Arrow placed at number 8, despite its overall convenience being a huge point of contention among fans. Firstly, I actually quite like the Still Silver Arrow thematically. I think forging an arrow from the victims of Yhwach's evil, including Uryu's mother, to then shoot at him and essentially reverse said evil act upon him is excellent and really works. Secondly, the ending of Bleach was so tumultuous on the whole that I think the Still Silver Arrow ended up ultimately being overshadowed by, well, the actual ending itself, and was seen as just a symptom of a much larger problem. And finally, while the Still Silver Arrow looks as though it will make an appearance in the anime, there is time for it to be fixed, reworked, or even just more adequately foreshadowed. The idea is totally sound in my opinion, it's just the execution that needed work. And the anime has already begun to foreshadow the arrow's existence in ways the manga simply never did, which is very promising indeed. Moving on, in 7th place we have the surprise reveal that spawned a million memes. Yes, Aizen really did plan absolutely everything. Look, Aizen was already a beloved and iconic villain, well known for being an incredible and near-flawless schemer, who was always at least 3 steps ahead of the Gotei 13. Whether faking his own death with Kyoka Suigetsu, masterminding the holification of the would-be Vizard, or trapping multiple captains in Wako Mundo using Orihime as bait, Aizen was always ahead of the curve in ways that really worked for the villain. However, in chapter 396, Kubo pulled back the curtain and revealed that Aizen had planned, well, literally everything about Ichigo's entire journey so far, over the course of the previous 396 chapters. Across the next couple of chapters, Aizen goes on an extended, lengthy monologue to a totally dumbfounded Ichigo, revealing that yes, he was behind virtually everything that had transpired in the manga so far. From sending Rukia to Karakura Town, to Fishbone D's arrival, to the Menos Grande showing up, to Rukia's eventual arrest, and then even each and every one of Ichigo's tentpole fights, with Ichigo being at the perfect level at which to battle these individual opponents, thanks to him essentially walking the path that Aizen has laid out for him. From Uryu and Renji to Kenpachi and Byakuya, to even later fights with Grimjo and Ulquiorra, every single step and stage of Ichigo's growth and development at that point had supposedly taken place in the palm of Aizen's hand, all because Ichigo was the best subject for Aizen's research into transcending the boundaries of Shinigami and Hollow. So enormous was the magnitude of this reveal, it completely changed the way we looked at the story that had preceded it. It forced Kubo to recontextualize previous assertions made by Aizen himself on the fly, with Ichigo calling out Aizen saying one thing in the past only for Aizen to just claim it was a lie. The truth is that it doesn't really make any sense and was clearly reworked to fit this new narrative, much like how Aizen supposedly didn't know what the Hogyoku looked like in the Soul Society arc, when we come to know later on that must be impossible. Like I said, these days, this reveal is kind of treated more like a meme than anything else, with even the anime seemingly getting in on it, and the Everything But the Rain arc helps to make it all work a little better, at least in my opinion, with Aizen witnessing the coming together of Isshin and Masaki, and at least starting his plan in a slightly more uncertain place. At least regarding Ichigo anyway. But the truth is that certainly back then, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and felt unbelievable even for Aizen. Even worse, though, was that it single-handedly robbed Ichigo of almost all of his agency throughout the story to date. In fact, it wasn't just Ichigo who suffered the repercussions of this, but supposedly the events of all characters involved with his journey were somehow manipulated by this ultimate puppet master, narrowing the scope of the story and stretching the suspension of disbelief to breaking point. Next up, just missing out on the top 5, we have another character death. One that sent shockwaves rippling throughout the community all those years ago. When Gin Ichimaru was killed in chapter 416 after a botched assassination attempt on Aizen, it was probably the angriest I'd ever seen the readership at the time. Of course, Gin was, and probably remains to this day, one of the most popular characters in Bleach, and while I was never personally surprised that he died, the manner of his death definitely seemed to upset a lot of people. With Aizen close to achieving his goal, having begun to transcend and let his guard down as a result, Gin suddenly strikes, attempting to kill his former captain and master after centuries of planning, wanting to avenge Matsumoto after Aizen harvested a portion of her soul for his Hogyoku many years ago. Although Gin comes extremely close to succeeding, using the poison of his bankai to rend Aizen's body in two and take back the Hogyoku for himself, the Hogyoku resurrects Aizen all the same, transforming him into the infamous Butterflyzen and turning him into a being who has surpassed both Shinigami and Hollow. From here, Aizen takes back the Hogyoku and proceeds to butcher Gin, nearly cleaving him in two before ripping his arm off, stabbing him through the gut, and then sending him flying through a building to seal the deal. To be completely honest, it seemed like the community was mad about, well, almost all of this sequence at the time. A lot of complaints were directed at how easily Gin was killed, despite the heroes supposedly surviving the same, if not more severe injuries all the time. We'll get into that in a minute. While others hated Aizen's resurrection, and especially what he became as a result. To be honest, back in the day, Deicide was a very controversial arc in general, and I think it is definitely looked upon more fondly nowadays. As for Gin, to be honest, I never really had a huge problem with the manner of his death, other than it maybe feeling a little rushed after such a long period of build-up for the character. I mean, he was being pulled apart by a totally transcendent Aizen at this point. As far as I'm concerned, he did extraordinarily well to survive the first slash, let alone the next three. And when it comes to villains, I kind of always expect them to die at some point anyway. It was the same with Ulquiorra many chapters prior, though that felt considerably less controversial even back then. Alright, but in 5th place, we have the reveal and usage of the Shinken Hakyoken, a mythical mirrored Zanpakuto designed to reflect God's power. As Kyoraku battles Sternritter X the X-axis Lige Barrow, it becomes increasingly clear that there is just no conceivable way to actually defeat this guy. Kyoraku forces Lige to use Volstendish, at which point he becomes totally intangible. However, after exploiting a loophole using his bankai, Kyoraku manages to decapitate and kill the Quincy, seemingly ending the fight. Except Lige survives again against all odds and returns, reforming his destroyed head, transforming into a draconic angel, and overwhelming the head captain. It's only then that Nanao joins the fight, revealing that she is the destined wielder of the Shinken Hakyoken, a ceremonial Zanpakuto held by the Issei clan whose mirrors can reflect and disperse the light of God. Amazingly, this is exactly what they need to defeat the otherwise completely unkillable Sternritter, and Nanao, with Kyoraku's help, wields the Shinken Hakyoken in battle against Lige, eventually reflecting his ultimate attack right back at him, dispersing his divine power, and reducing him to a mortal man. Again, thematically, this is a cool idea, and yes, the Issei Shrine is a very real place in Japan, reported to be the ancestral home of the mythical Yata no Kagami, or Sacred Mirror. But there's no denying that this is exactly what Kyoraku and Nanao needed against the one opponent who required such a weapon to be defeated. Look, again, on a personal level, I find it hard to be too aggrieved by the Shinken Hakyoken because I really enjoy the writing and the set dressing around it, and I love the backstory for Kyoraku. I just can't help but wish the sword had been foreshadowed in some way or utilised beforehand. Again, you could argue that Nanao being a part of the Issei clan is foreshadowing, maybe, though I think that's pretty flimsy and very niche, but the better argument is that they, of all characters, happen to come across the one Quincy against whom Nanao's very circumstantial blade is actually useful. I've said it before, but I mean, it feels like a no-brainer to me that the Shinken Hakyoken should have been revealed in a flashback about the fall of Ryo, and the splitting apart of his body around the time the Soul King was killed in the manga. That way, we would know of its existence, and it then being revealed against Lige would have been a crazy twist. Instead, it is incredibly convenient, even if thematically it is pretty cool, and the anime makes that entire sequence look absolutely wonderful. Right, but in 4th place, we have what I would argue is still one of the most unpopular moments in Bleach to this very day. Looking back at the list, I think the community has come round on a number of these once controversial moments, Gein's death, the Shinken Hakyoken, even things like Unohana's death to some degree, but this one is still very contentious. And of course, it's the reveal that Yami was in fact the Zero Espada all along. Now, I've dunked on this moment a lot in the past, so there isn't too much to say here. But yeah, this was absurd, and was rightly rebuked by the community even so many years ago. Now, to be fair, I've always pushed back to some degree by pointing out that Yami was clearly always considered one of the most important Espada by Kubo, whether people liked the character or not. But that doesn't mean he suddenly had to become the Zero Espada out of nowhere of all things. A near mythical position at that time that, if it existed at all, many speculated would end up being revealed to be someone like Wonderweiss instead, around whom there was so much mystery. Not given to the bumbling, loud-mouthed, two-dimensional loser of an Espada who spends the entire arc getting his ass handed to him by every character he comes across. Now, dialing it back, I don't even mind Yami as a character that much, as long as he stays in his lane. But this wasn't right for him. It was a cheap twist for a twist's sake, to arbitrarily keep Byakuya and Kenpachi busy for the remainder of the arc. When in reality, this fight, this victory, should have gone to Chad, Rukia, and Renji. And that only serves to make this whole thing feel even worse. Characters who needed a win at this stage in the arc were sidelined for popular fanfare. And then, the fight concludes off-screen anyway. Alright, but heading into the top 3, these should all be fairly obvious, I imagine. And up first, in third place, is the original off-screen defeat of the Zero Division in Chapter 611. This was a big one during the manga's original run, and I remember that I could scarcely believe it. The build-up for the Zero Division, the enigmatic royal guard who protected the Soul King himself, had been enormous, for lack of a better word. As a community, we'd been actively waiting to see these guys in action, I would say since the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, when they were mentioned by Kyoraku, though the idea of a royal guard had been floated earlier in the story too. But this mention, though, felt like the first time they were made real within the story, that it felt like we might actually meet them at some point, and again, Kubo even committed to their appearance in the Thousand Year Blood War arc in an interview before the final arc began. And compounding things even further, when the Zero Division were finally revealed in Chapter 516, they were introduced with incredibly high expectations on their backs, as Kyoraku announces that the 5 of them, together, were even stronger than the entire Gotei 13. And while the leader of the Zero Division, Ichibei, absolutely lived up to the hype, well, the other 4 members were massively disappointing. Sure, they get a couple of cool moments in the initial stage of Yhwach's assault on the palace, with Senjumaru killing a Sternritter in the blink of an eye, and Oetsu cutting down every member of the Schutzstaffel with ease, but it's ultimately all for nothing. Yhwach resurrects his men, and while many of us felt like that was the build-up, and the true fight was only just beginning, the reality that awaited us was much different. The scene changed, showing us instead the battle between Ichibei and Yhwach, and by the time that fight was over, Yhwach simply announced that Squad Zero had fallen off screen, and that was that. They were never seen again. This was massive, and it really felt like, perhaps for the first time, that there was evidence of the wheels beginning to fall off the arc, which had started so strongly. So much build-up, so much anticipation, years of waiting, and the Zero Division ended up ultimately managing to achieve even less than the Vizard did when they joined in the fight at the fake Karakura town, and they weren't exactly impressive either for the most part, Hachi notwithstanding. Of course, the anime went a very long way to vastly improving this moment in virtually every way, and delivering on Kubo's original vision for this epic showdown, which was amazing and very cathartic to see. Okay, so when it comes to the ending of Bleach, I can't help but feel that it's all pretty controversial at the end of the day. It kind of occurred to me that I haven't really spoken about the ending of the manga in a dedicated way since my last chapter review in 2016, so I'd like to do that at some point. For the purposes of this video though, I think it's pretty clear that with certain parts of the community, the most controversial element of the ending by far was of course who ended up with who. After the 10-year time skip, it is revealed that Ichigo and Orihime are now married and have a child together, while Rukia and Renji are married as well, with a daughter of their own, completely upending years and years of fan debate and, frankly, war. I'll be completely honest, despite being an active member of this community since way back when, I have no skin in this game whatsoever and never did. If you go back and look at my old reactions and reviews to the final few chapters, I'd make it pretty clear that the question of who ended up with who just wasn't that important to me, as it was already going to be such a tiny part of the series, and Kubo himself had said as much on occasion. But also, again, as I note in those last few reactions and reviews, the pairings ended up, let's be honest, exactly as I thought they would. And it kind of felt like Kubo spent the entire final arc setting them up, to be totally honest. Rukia and Renji spend the whole arc together for the most part, while Ichigo and Orihime work closer than ever before, especially towards the climax of the war. And Orihime's attraction towards Ichigo in particular is referenced way more often and way more explicitly, really, than ever before, in a way that Ichigo can kind of awkwardly reciprocate. Such as the scene that was removed from the anime, where Ichigo is asked his opinion on Orihime's new Urahara-made outfit. Off-the-cuff, seemingly random moments like that would simply have never been included if Kubo had no intention of having them get together in some way, even a minimal way, by the end of the story. But yeah, I feel like I remember people going absolutely crazy over this, some of them burning their volumes and whatnot, which again, as always, just seemed absurd to me. To be honest, I was too busy being disappointed about everything else that went down. Or didn't go down, I guess. Everything that we didn't see or learn by the end of chapter 686. I'll tell you, the fact that Kisuke was completely missing in action was a much bigger deal to me than any of the romantic pairings, or the fact that the Soul King had apparently been killed again with the advent of Yhwach's death, yet the worlds were now inexplicably totally fine without explanation. Yeah, maybe I should make a dedicated video on the ending at some point. I think it'd be fun to do. In fact, the lead up to Core 4, seems like a great and natural time to do it. But yeah, regarding controversies, like I said, the ending in general was very controversial. But the reveals that Ichigo and Orihime were married, as were Rukia and Renji, definitely caused something of a meltdown, again among parts of the community, and I kind of can't wait to see if it happens again. But probably the single most controversial moment in all of Bleach that I can remember, and one that I did actually have an opinion on this time when it was all unfolding, a time that I can remember very vividly, was of course the not quite death of Byakuya Kuchiki during the first Quincy invasion. Now look, there are a few things to understand about this moment and the momentum that accompanied it at the time before we really dive in. Bleach was experiencing an incredible renaissance, a fantastic string of chapters. The collective community high that surrounded the first Quincy invasion was unlike anything I had seen for probably years, to be totally honest. Lapsed readers were back, veteran readers were completely reinvigorated, and the future looked incredibly bright. As Yhwach's Stern Ritter assaulted the Serete, it kind of felt like anything could happen. One of the biggest, long-standing criticisms of Bleach, whether you think it's unfounded or not, one that actively ties into another controversial moment on this list, Gin's death, was that the heroes of Bleach never died. Almost every single villain was killed off with varying degrees of difficulty, but the heroes would survive no matter what, no matter the severity of the injury. And yet, all of a sudden, that seemed to be changing. Prior to the invasion, Sasakibe was brutally murdered, and then as soon as the invasion began, it seemed as though Izuru was also killed in the blink of an eye. Then, up came Byakuya. Facing off against Asnod, Byakuya was quickly overwhelmed by the Quincy's power of the fear, and in a 1-2 punch had his bankai stolen before it was then used against him to devastating effect. In chapter 502, Byakuya was seemingly killed as Asnod used Senbon Zakura Kageyoshi to completely gut the captain, eviscerating his entire chest, with Kubo even going so far as to show the captain, in what was back then an infamous image, his rib cage exposed, slumped in a hole coated in his own blood. Hashwolf then states, as if to hammer it home, it seems Byakuya Kuchiki has died. And, well, the community was set ablaze. Byakuya remains to this day one of Bleach's very most popular characters. He's one of my favourite characters too, and I genuinely couldn't fathom what I was reading. But I didn't hate that he was dead in the immediate aftermath. Again, you can go back and have a look at those early chapter reviews. In fact, I kind of loved the idea that the stakes had been raised to such a degree. Of course, the warring was intense. On one side of the community, it seemed as though Kubo had turned over a new leaf and was going to start killing even the most popular of characters, while on the other side, people were very unhappy that it seemed like Kubo was going to start mowing down established fan favourites just like that, as though they meant nothing. And then on the other side entirely, people were certain that it was a fake out, that there was no way Byakuya was actually dead. And caught in the middle of it all, like a tumultuous maelstrom, were the Byakuya fans who screamed and cried, who quit the series, and yes, supposedly even those who sent death threats to Kubo himself, which of course is ridiculous and unacceptable. The veracity or the extent of said death threats I don't think has ever been fully confirmed, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised. But there's no denying it was maybe the most shocking thing I had ever seen in the series at that point. Not only Byakuya's death, but the brutality, the savagery behind it, and yes, the ease at which he fell. It felt like a complete gut punch. I remember drawing some fan art at the time and getting comments from people who said that they could no longer read the series. It was crazy. That they didn't want to read the latest chapter because they couldn't bear to see it. But then things got even crazier. In chapter 512, it was revealed that Byakuya was still alive, despite Hashwalth's earlier assertion, and was capable of one final conversation with Ichigo, even lamenting that he didn't have much time left, before dropping his Zanpakuto, Senbonzakura shattering into the wind completely. Okay, now he was definitely dead, and it was a lovely send-off, and as I've said before, regardless of the ultimate outcome, it remains one of, if not my favourite scene in Bleach. As he cries, begging Ichigo for help, Byakuya's development comes full circle in a truly wonderful way. Except, maybe not. In chapter 515, in the direct aftermath of the invasion, it was revealed by a member of the Raiteitai that Byakuya had in fact survived, albeit he was now comatose, and the community was in uproar once again. While the first Quincy invasion was still remarkably well received, and deservedly so, there was no doubt that this put an early and sizable dent in the Thousand Year Blood War arc's credibility, despite the fact the stakes were still clearly higher than they had ever been. I mean, poor old Yamamoto had literally just been killed. Just because he wasn't the most popular character in the world doesn't lessen the impact of that. It feels to me like the debate surrounding Byakuya's near-death experience was perhaps the debate that permeated the community the longest, that raged the longest, and in some respects is still going today. Should the captain of the 6th Division have been killed? What would it have meant for the development of Rukia and Renji if he had, compared to what we see from them with his survival? Does Byakuya contribute enough to the rest of the arc having survived? Did Kubo plan for his survival, or was it a knee-jerk reaction to the response his death received? The questions swirled like crazy back in the day. For what it's worth, I was disappointed to learn Byakuya had survived. But as I said, Byakuya is a favourite of mine, and ultimately I was happy to keep him around, and I was especially pleased to see how he interacted with Rukia at the climax of her battle with Asnod, something that worked really well and helped to further their relationship in a meaningful way. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. Those are what I think were the 10 most controversial Bleach manga moments with the community way back in the day. It's a long time ago now, and to be totally honest, I do miss those days quite a lot, and it was really funny to see the different discussions and conversations that people were having week in, week out. Before I eventually joined in a very explicit way with my review of chapter 496, I was enjoying the Thousand Year Blood War arc so very much. The first Quincy invasion had just begun, that I had to get started with talking about it on YouTube, and well, the rest is history. Do let me know down in the comments below your thoughts and feelings on these 10 moments that I have selected. If you were familiar with the community at the time, do you agree that these were some of the most controversial, some of the most hotly debated? I'd love to get your thoughts down in the comments below. And of course, if I've missed any, do please let me know as well. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I took something of value away from this video as well today. Consider hitting subscribe below if you did. It is quick and easy to do, and it does help out the channel massively. I really do appreciate it. Check out my Patreon as well. If you want to help support the channel that extra step further, that does make a huge difference in helping to keep the lights on here on the channel. And again, it means absolutely everything to me. So once again, thank you all so very much. And a big, big thank you and an extra shout out to everyone who is supporting me over on Patreon. That really does go a very long way. All right, everyone, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.